She wasn't wearing a white coat. She didn't have a badge. She didn't speak much. To them, she was just another pretty young volunteer, blonde, polite, and probably unqualified. But when the heart monitor failed during a high-risk surgery and the hospital's top surgeon froze, she walked forward and said 7 words that silenced an entire operating room. Before we tell you what happened next, where are you watching from today? The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Operating Room 5 at St. Andrew's Medical Center, casting their sterile glow across the assembled surgical team. 7-year-old Tommy Richardson lay unconscious on the table, his small chest rising and falling with the mechanical precision as the heart surgery continued into its third hour. The rhythmic beeping of monitors created a symphony of life, each tone a reassurance that everything was proceeding as planned. In the corner of the room, barely noticed by the focused medical staff, stood a young woman who had become as familiar as the hospital walls themselves, Eleanor Grant. Though everyone simply called her Ellie, had been volunteering at St. Andrews for nearly 2 years now. At 29, she possessed a quiet beauty that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within her soul, rather than from any external adornment. Her light blonde hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail that had seen better days, and her clear blue-gray eyes held a gentleness that made patients feel safe, yet carried an observant quality that few people ever noticed. She wore the same simple outfit she favored every day, a light linen blouse that had been washed so many times it felt like silk against her skin. Paired with khakis that were practical rather than fashionable, her white sneakers had walked countless miles through these hospital corridors, and her faded canvas backpack had become her constant companion. Though no one ever asked what she carried inside it, there was something effortlessly beautiful about her natural appearance. No makeup adorned her features. No jewelry caught the light. She was the kind of woman who spoke softly, moved with careful deliberation, and rarely interrupted conversations, even when she had something important to contribute. To the doctors, nurses, and administrators at St. Andrews, Ellie was simply the pretty volunteer girl who seemed to appear wherever she was needed most. They appreciated her dedication, her gentle way with patience, and her uncanny ability to anticipate what they needed before they asked. What they never questioned was why she always seemed to gravitate toward the operating rooms, why her eyes followed the surgical machines with such intense focus, or why she sometimes whispered technical specifications under her breath when she thought no one was listening. The surgery was progressing smoothly when the first sign of trouble appeared. A subtle change in the rhythm of the oxygen compressor caught Ellie's attention long before the medical staff noticed anything amiss. She stepped forward slightly, her eyes fixed on the machine's digital display, watching as the numbers began to fluctuate in a pattern she recognized all too well. Then it happened. The oxygen compressor stalled with a mechanical groan that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Within seconds, emergency beeps erupted from multiple machines, creating a cacophony of electronic panic. The surgical team froze for a split second, their training kicking in as they began to assess the situation. Dr. Martinez, the head surgeon, never lifted his eyes from Tommy's chest, but his voice carried the tension that everyone felt. "Talk to me, people. What's our status?" The anesthesiologist's voice was tight with concern. "Oxygen levels are dropping. We need that compressor online now." Panic began to build in the room like a living thing, feeding off the urgency of the situation. The circulating nurse rushed to the machine, her hands moving frantically over the controls. The biomedical technician on call was being paged, but everyone knew that precious seconds were ticking away. Tommy's life hung in the balance, and the very machine designed to keep him alive had become a potential threat. That's when Ellie's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Bypass the main relay. Use the override key under the panel. Her words were delivered with such calm authority that they seemed to suspend the panic for a moment. Dr. Rodriguez, a third-year resident who had always been friendly to Ellie, turned toward her with confusion and frustration etched across his features. "Ma'am, please step back. This is a restricted area." But Ellie didn't move. Instead, she met his gaze with those steady blue-gray eyes and spoke with the same quiet confidence that had always characterized her presence in the hospital. "I wrote the firmware 12 years ago." The words hung in the air like a revelation that changed everything and nothing all at once. A stunned silence spread across the room, broken only by the continued beeping of the monitors and the sound of Tommy's mechanical breathing. Dr. Martinez finally looked up from his patient, his surgical mask unable to hide the bewilderment in his eyes. The circulating nurse, following Ellie's instructions almost without conscious thought, lifted the panel that had never been opened in anyone's memory. There, exactly where Ellie had said it would be, was a small override key that looked like it had been waiting years for this moment. With trembling fingers, she turned the key, and the oxygen compressor hummed back to life with a sound that was more beautiful than any symphony. Tommy's oxygen levels stabilized immediately, and the emergency beeps faded into the background hum of normal operations. The surgical team resumed their work with practiced efficiency, but the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. Every person present knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the quiet volunteer who had been among them for so long. Dr. Martinez, his hands still steady despite the shock, managed to speak without taking his eyes off his patient. "Who the hell is she?" Ellie reached into her faded canvas backpack and withdrew something that looked like a relic from another life. An old MedTech systems badge, its plastic surface scratched and worn, but the text still clearly visible. Dr. Eleanor Grant, Biomedical Systems Engineer, Patent Holder Ventura 9. The very machine that had just saved Tommy's life bore her signature in its most fundamental code. She held the badge for just long enough for everyone to see it, to understand that the woman they had dismissed as simply a volunteer was actually the brilliant engineer who had designed the systems that kept their patients alive every single day. Then, with the same quiet grace that had defined her presence in their lives, she slipped the badge back into her backpack and walked toward the door. As she reached the threshold, she paused for just a moment, her hand on the doorframe. Without turning around, she spoke one final time, her voice carrying a weight that none of them had ever heard before. "Take care of Tommy. He's going to be just fine." And then she was gone, leaving behind a room full of medical professionals who suddenly realized they had never really seen her at all. The morning sun filtered through the expansive windows of St. Andrew's Medical Center's main lobby, casting geometric patterns across the polished marble floors. At exactly 9 o'clock, as she had every weekday for the past 2 years, Eleanor Grant stepped through the automatic doors carrying the weight of a carefully constructed new identity. The golden light caught her clean features, illuminating the natural beauty that seemed to radiate from within rather than from any artificial enhancement. Her movements were purposeful, yet unhurried as she made her way to the volunteer station, her faded canvas backpack settling comfortably against her shoulder. The familiar routine began immediately. Ellie methodically stocked the supply stations with fresh gloves, ensuring each dispenser was filled to capacity. She moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, wiping down surfaces that had already been cleaned by the night staff, refilling sanitizer dispensers that were barely half empty. To the casual observer, these tasks might have seemed menial, even unnecessary. But for Ellie, each action served a deeper purpose. Every moment spent in these hallways was an opportunity to observe, to understand, to silently monitor the intricate dance of medical technology that kept this place functioning. As she worked, she offered gentle waves to patients shuffling past in their hospital gowns, their faces etched with worry and hope in equal measure. Her soft smiles seemed to carry a healing quality of their own, a wordless reassurance that someone cared about their journey through this intimidating maze of modern medicine. Children especially seemed drawn to her quiet presence, finding comfort in her unhurried movements and patient demeanor. What Ellie couldn't see, but had grown accustomed to feeling, were the conversations that followed in her wake. Near the nurse's station, Dr. Kevin Mills, a second-year intern whose confidence far exceeded his experience, leaned against the counter with the casual arrogance that medical school had somehow failed to cure. His voice carried just loud enough to ensure his opinions reached their intended audience. "She's definitely attractive. I'll give her that," he muttered to Sarah Chen, a nurse who had been working these floors longer than Kevin had been studying medicine. "But she's clearly not qualified for anything more substantial than what she's doing. Probably signed up for volunteer work just so she could tell people at parties that she works in healthcare." Sarah, who had developed a finely tuned radar for dismissive attitudes after 15 years in the profession, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. It was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a resident in emergency medicine, who picked up the thread of conversation with a scoff that bordered on cruel. "Does she even understand what a defibrillator does? I've seen her staring at the equipment like she's trying to solve some great mystery. It's almost endearing, in a completely naive way." The conversation might have continued, but Linda Rodriguez, the charge nurse whose authority was respected even by attending physicians, had heard enough. She rolled her eyes with the practiced motion of someone who had witnessed too many variations of this same scene. "These cute girls with clipboards," she said, her tone carrying years of accumulated frustration. "Welcome to every hospital fundraiser, every volunteer program, every well-intentioned community outreach effort. They show up, they look pretty, they make the donors feel good about themselves, and then they disappear when they realize this work actually matters." What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that the woman they were dismissing with such casual cruelty had once been the youngest lead developer in the history of MedTech systems, Dr. Eleanor Grant, before she had legally changed her surname to distance herself from a past that haunted her every waking moment, had been the brilliant mind behind the surgical monitoring systems that now kept their patients alive. She had been the visionary who had designed the very machines they trusted with human lives, the engineer whose innovations had revolutionized cardiac surgery across 3 continents. But brilliance, Ellie had learned, meant nothing when tragedy struck close to home. Her younger sister Emma had been just 22 when she was wheeled into an operating room not unlike the ones at St. Andrews. The surgery should have been routine, a simple procedure to repair a heart valve that had been damaged since birth. Emma had been nervous but optimistic, joking with the nurses about finally being able to run a marathon once her heart was fixed. The glitch that killed Emma was one that Ellie had identified in the software months earlier. She had written report after report, attended meeting after meeting, pleading with the executives at MedTech to implement the necessary patches. But deadlines were deadlines and profits were profits, and her warnings had been filed away under the category of acceptable risk. When Emma's monitoring system failed during the most critical moment of her surgery, when the alarms that should have sounded remained silent, Ellie had watched her sister slip away while the medical team operated blindly, unaware that their technological eyes and ears had abandoned them. The lawsuit had been settled quietly, with non-disclosure agreements that prevented Ellie from ever speaking publicly about what had happened. But no legal document could silence the voice in her head that whispered the same terrible truth over and over again. Her sister had died because she hadn't fought hard enough, hadn't pushed hard enough, hadn't been willing to sacrifice her career to save Emma's life. So Ellie had disappeared. She resigned from MedTech systems without explanation, declined invitations to tech conferences where she had once been a keynote speaker, and legally changed her name to sever the last public connection to her former life. The brilliant Dr. Eleanor Grant ceased to exist, replaced by a quiet volunteer whose only apparent qualification was an earnest desire to help. Now she watched and learned and waited, positioning herself as close as possible to the technology she had created, monitoring its performance with the eye of someone who understood every line of code, every circuit pathway, every potential point of failure. She had become the guardian angel that the system itself couldn't be, the human backup for the technological systems that she no longer trusted completely. As the morning progressed and she moved closer to the OR hallway, her vigilance was interrupted by a sharp voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Excuse me, Miss." Nurse Patricia Coleman stepped directly into Ellie's path, her arms crossed in a gesture that brooked no argument. "You can't stand here. Volunteers don't belong near sterile zones. This area is restricted to medical personnel only." Ellie nodded politely, the same gentle acquiescence she had perfected over 2 years of similar encounters. She stepped back without protest, without explanation, without revealing that she probably understood the sterile protocols better than most of the people who worked in these halls. But as she retreated to an acceptable distance, her trained eyes caught sight of something that made her breath catch in her throat. They were rolling in a machine she had co-designed, one of the newer models that incorporated lessons learned from Emma's death, and something about its startup sequence, something in the pattern of lights across its display panel, wasn't quite right. The memory arrived without warning, as it always did, cutting through her carefully constructed composure like a blade through silk. Emma's voice echoed in her mind with crystalline clarity. The final voicemail that Ellie had saved on 3 different devices, unable to delete it even after 2 years of listening to it in moments of crisis. Her sister's words carried the weight of prophecy, spoken just hours before the surgery that would claim her life. "Ellie, if you ever see something wrong, promise me you won't stay quiet. Promise me you'll be brave enough to speak up, even when it's scary, even when people don't want to listen. You're the smartest person I know, and sometimes smart people have to carry the burden of protecting everyone else." The words had been spoken with Emma's characteristic optimism, her voice light with the confidence of someone who believed her big sister could fix anything, solve any problem, overcome any obstacle. Emma had always seen Ellie as invincible, a technological wizard whose innovations made the impossible seem routine. She never could have imagined that her sister's greatest failure would be her inability to save the person who mattered most. Standing in the hallway outside Operating Room 5, watching the machine she had helped design display warning patterns that others couldn't recognize, Ellie felt the familiar paralysis that had defined her existence since Emma's death. Her body moved in a subtle dance of indecision, one step forward toward the sterile zone where she wasn't supposed to be, then one step back into the safe territory of volunteer compliance. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the straps of her canvas backpack, the weight of knowledge pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The pattern of lights on the machine's display panel told a story that only she could read completely. She had written the diagnostic protocols herself, had spent countless nights debugging the sensor arrays that were now reporting false readings. The oxygen compressor was functioning perfectly, but the monitoring system was receiving corrupted data from a secondary sensor that most technicians didn't even know existed. In 15 minutes, maybe 20 at most, the primary system would override the false readings and automatically shut down to protect itself from what it perceived as dangerous operating conditions. The thought of another child dying while she stood silent in the hallway was unbearable. But the thought of speaking up, of revealing herself, of risking the exposure that would inevitably follow, sent waves of anxiety through her chest. She had built her anonymity carefully, crafted her invisibility with the same precision she had once applied to complex engineering problems. To step forward now would be to shatter the protective shell she had constructed around her wounded soul. Then the monitor failed, exactly as she had predicted, and a 7-year-old boy named Tommy Richardson began dying on the table in front of her. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. The hesitant volunteer who had been shifting nervously in the hallway vanished, replaced by the brilliant engineer who had once commanded rooms full of senior executives and world-renowned surgeons. Ellie's voice cut through the chaos with the kind of authority that came from absolute certainty, her words precise and specific, carrying the weight of knowledge that had been earned through years of designing the very systems that were now failing. Bypass the main relay, use the override key under the panel, but her intervention didn't end with words. As the surgical team struggled to process her instructions, Ellie moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had performed this exact procedure hundreds of times in testing environments. Her hands found the rear panel of the machine with unerring accuracy, her fingers dancing across diagnostic interfaces that most people never knew existed. She bypassed the corrupted sensor with a series of commands that seemed almost like magic to the observers, then accessed the airflow algorithm directly through a maintenance protocol that required administrator-level clearance. The entire process took less than 30 seconds. Tommy's color returned from the dangerous pallor that had begun spreading across his small features, and the monitors resumed their steady reassurance that life was being sustained. The room fell into a stunned silence that spoke volumes about the impossibility of what they had just witnessed. A volunteer, someone they had dismissed as decorative and largely irrelevant, had just performed a technical rescue that none of them could have imagined, let alone executed. The surgery continued without further incident, but the atmosphere in Operating Room 5 had been fundamentally altered. Every person present understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary, though none of them could fully comprehend the depth of expertise that had just been revealed. When Tommy was finally wheeled to recovery, his vital signs strong and stable, the surgical team dispersed with the kind of quiet bewilderment that follows truly unprecedented events. Later that afternoon, as Ellie performed her usual volunteer duties with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her presence for 2 years, she found herself restocking juice boxes in the small break room adjacent to the pediatric ward. The familiar routine provided a meditative quality that helped calm the emotional turbulence that followed her public revelation. Her hands moved automatically, arranging the colorful packages with the precise organization that had always characterized her approach to any task. The soft sound of footsteps behind her announced the arrival of someone who had been searching for her specifically. Dr. Richard Matthews, the head of surgery at St. Andrew's Medical Center, stood in the dark way, holding a manila folder that seemed to contain the weight of revelation. His expression combined curiosity, respect, and something that might have been embarrassment as he approached the woman who had just redefined everything he thought he knew about the people working in his hospital. Dr. Grant, he said quietly, using the title and name that hadn't been spoken aloud in her presence for over 2 years. I've been doing some research this afternoon. The folder in his hands contained her patent filings, her engineering credentials, her published research papers, and the tragic story of her sister's death that had been buried in legal documents and sealed court records. Her entire history, laid bare in corporate letterhead and technical specifications that painted the picture of a brilliant mind that had been broken by unthinkable loss. "Why didn't you say something?" Dr. Matthews asked, his voice carrying the kind of gentle respect reserved for someone whose pain was finally understood. "Why didn't you tell us who you were, what you were capable of? We could have used your expertise. We could have learned from you." Ellie turned from the juice boxes with the same quiet grace that had defined her volunteer persona, but now her blue-gray eyes carried a depth that revealed the engineer beneath the surface. Her smile was gentle but tinged with sadness, the expression of someone who had made peace with choices that others might never understand. "Because no one asked," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of 2 years of careful invisibility. "And because I wasn't ready to be that person again. But today, someone needed me to remember who I used to be. Today, a little boy needed me to stop hiding." The words hung in the air between them, an explanation that revealed as much about healing as it did about loss, as much about redemption as it did about grief. In that moment, Dr. Matthews understood that he wasn't just looking at a brilliant engineer who had been masquerading as a volunteer. He was witnessing the emergence of someone who had finally found the courage to reclaim the gifts that tragedy had forced her to abandon. She wasn't just another pretty face. She wasn't just a girl with good intentions. She was a builder of life-saving technology, and she stayed quiet until it mattered most. True strength doesn't always show up in power suits or behind podiums. Sometimes it wears a loose ponytail and smiles while sweeping the floor. So next time you see someone simple, silent, or soft-spoken, look again, because they may be the reason someone lives. If this story moved you, drop a comment. Subscribe for more real stories that restore your faith in quiet heroes.